All right, now that you know the basic idea behind cell respiration and why after cell respiration releases energy from food, why that energy is stored in ATP. Now we're going to talk more about the details of cell respiration, and it turns out there's two different kinds of cell respiration that occur in cells. That is, two different ways that cells can break down food to release the energy and create ATP. So the first type of cell respiration is called aerobic respiration. Some of you may have heard the word aerobic before. You probably heard it in context of exercise, aerobic exercise. As it turns out, there is a direct relationship between the kind of exercise you do and the kind of cell respiration you do. When you do aerobic activity, aerobic exercise, your muscles are primarily getting energy by doing aerobic respiration. So the word aerobic actually is one of these words that means what it sounds like. Aerobic means with air or with oxygen. So when your cells have sufficient oxygen in them, particularly your muscle cells, they will burn food aerobically. They'll break it down with oxygen gas. Oxygen gas, when you react food with oxygen gas, that's what we call burning the food. In fact, the word burn means to break down with oxygen. So when you do aerobic respiration, when your cells are doing aerobic respiration, like when you're doing aerobic exercise, you are burning sugar and fat. That is, you're breaking it down with oxygen gas. And this is a very efficient way to break down food. Oxygen gas allows you to break down food very efficiently to release maximum amount of energy from food. When you break down food molecules, the molecules don't just disappear. The larger, remember, during a chemical reaction, you don't lose atoms or gain atoms. So all the atoms that are in sugar and fat molecules, which are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms, they end up in product molecules after these food molecules have been broken down. So during aerobic respiration, food molecules are broken down with oxygen to create water and carbon dioxide gas. Those are the chemicals that you end aerobic respiration with. The chemicals you start it with are sugar or fat and oxygen gas. The chemicals you end it with are water and carbon dioxide. These chemicals are what sugar and fat become when they've been broken down quite a bit. Because it takes less energy to hold together water and CO2 molecules, these are smaller, more stable molecules, than it does to hold together sugar and fat molecules, which are larger and less stable. This process of breaking down sugar and fat releases the extra energy. And this is, there's a lot of energy that's stored in sugar and fat. In fact, if you break down one sugar molecule aerobically to gas and water, you release enough energy in a cell for the cell to build 38 ATP molecules. Another way to say that is it takes 38 ATP molecules to store all the energy that you can release from burning one sugar molecule. So that's a lot of energy. Enough energy just from this one sugar to build 38 ATPs. Now remember, the ATPs are built from the smaller chemicals ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and just free phosphate. So we put 38 ATPs together with 38 phosphates, and we get 38 ATPs, which, as you'll recall, is the energy storing molecule in the cell. And the reason we use ATP, do you remember from the last video? It's because ATP can't leave the cell, right? You can get the energy out of it quickly by just breaking that one bond, and it can't leave the cell. So it's a very good energy storage chemical. So that's aerobic respiration. Now I'm going to sort of get into a myth right here. Something I said a little bit earlier about aerobic respiration wasn't quite right. It turns out that most of the aerobic respiration you do, you actually don't do when you're exercising. Most of the aerobic respiration you do at rest. And particularly the burning of fat. Most of the fat burning you do is at rest, not when you're exercising. In fact, if you're doing very vigorous workouts, aerobic or otherwise, your body is burning mostly sugar, because sugar is a quicker energy source. You need the energy fast when you're really working out, and sugar is a quicker energy source than fat. It takes much longer to burn fat than it does to burn sugar. And so while you're working out, your body's mostly burning sugar, not fat. When you're at rest is when your body burns fat, because it's got the time to do it. You don't need the energy that quickly. So when people do these vigorous workouts and they say, I'm burning fat, they're actually not. They're burning sugar and stores in their bodies, and really very little fat. Okay, so the other kind of cell respiration is what's called anaerobic. It's also called fermentation. So another name for anaerobic respiration is fermentation. So aerobic means with oxygen or with air. Anaerobic means without oxygen or without air. So this is where the way your cells get energy when they run out of oxygen, or when they don't have sufficient oxygen to do the aerobic respiration. So if your cells start running low on oxygen, or if they run out of oxygen, then they switch to anaerobic respiration or fermentation. Now, unfortunately, this process does not produce nearly as much energy. It's a much less efficient process. You really need the oxygen gas to do this complete breakdown of sugar and fat into water and CO2 to get maximum energy out. In other words, you break more bonds in food when you break them down with oxygen than you do when you break them down without oxygen. Also, breaking down food without oxygen creates toxic products, things that are damaging to cells. And they produce less energy. So you might wonder, well, why do cells do this if they're not getting much energy and they're making toxic products? And the answer is because a little bit of energy that they get this way is better than no energy. The alternative is no energy, because if you don't have oxygen, you can't do this. This requires oxygen. So if a cell runs out of oxygen or runs low on oxygen, it has to do this to get energy, any energy at all. The only advantage to anaerobic respiration, and it is a little bit of an advantage, is you can do this very fast. There aren't as many steps in anaerobic respiration as there are in aerobic. So this can be done quicker, fewer reactions, which means you can get the energy faster, but you don't get nearly as much energy. And that's a problem for cells. So the way cells do fermentation or anaerobic respiration is different depending on whether the cell is an animal cell or a plant cell or a fungus cell. Different kinds of cells do anaerobic respiration differently. All cells pretty much do aerobic respiration the same. But anaerobic respiration is done differently in different critters. So for example, in animal cells and also in human cells, when human and animal cells are forced to do anaerobic respiration, they break down sugar to something called lactic acid. So it's not broken down to water and CO2, it's broken down to lactic acid. This does produce a little bit of energy, but not nearly as much as this does. Only about 2 ATPs worth of energy per sugar. Compare that to the 38 ATPs per sugar you get from aerobic respiration of sugar. So you can see you get almost 20 times more energy from doing aerobic respiration on food as you do from doing anaerobic respiration of food. The other problem with anaerobic respiration is you can only do it on sugar. You can't break down fat without oxygen. So it limits also the food sources you can use. That's why anaerobic respiration is limited to situations either where you're not breathing, where we're just not taking in enough oxygen, or where our cells are using up oxygen so quickly that we can't get them more oxygen fast enough to keep them from doing this. And that occurs, anaerobic respiration occurs in your muscle cells, when you are working out very, very intensely, when you're really pushing your muscles to the limit. At that point, they can actually run out of oxygen because they use it up faster than the blood can deliver it to them. When your muscles do start to do anaerobic respiration, that's something you can feel, because at that point your muscle cells will start to build up lactic acid, and lactic acid is an acid, and acids burn, so your muscles will start to hurt. They'll start to ache and burn when you start building up that lactic acid in them. But that's just a sign that your muscle cells have switched to anaerobic respiration. Other critters can also do anaerobic respiration, but they do it differently. For example, plants and fungal cells, like yeast, which is a fungus, when they do anaerobic respiration of sugar, they don't turn the sugar into lactic acid. Instead, if you force a yeast cell to do anaerobic respiration by taking away its oxygen, it will break down sugar to what's called ethanol and carbon dioxide. So ethanol, most people know that as alcohol. That's drinking alcohol. It turns out that all the alcoholic beverages that are produced, every single one, is produced by the anaerobic respiration of yeast. That is, the fermentation of sugar by yeast. And the way you get yeast to ferment sugar instead of burn it is simply by putting them in a container and sealing it so that air can't get in. So when you take away air from yeast, they'll turn the sugar into ethanol and CO2 instead of into water and CO2. Once again, the energy yield is poor here. Yeast cells don't like to do fermentation because it creates something that's toxic to them, ethanol, and it doesn't give them much energy, only 2 ATPs per sugar instead of 38. But again, they'll do it if they're forced to, and you force them to by taking away their air. So when we want to create alcoholic beverages, we just take yeast and we give them some sugar, and then we put them in a container that's sealed or into an environment that doesn't have any oxygen available. And then they're forced, the lack of oxygen forces them into anaerobic respiration and forces them to create ethanol, which is the drinking alcohol that people enjoy. Okay, so keep in mind though that cells generally have if cells have a choice to do aerobic or anaerobic respiration, they're always going to choose aerobic because it just produces a lot more energy. It's a lot more efficient. Cells only go into anaerobic respiration when you force them to by taking away their oxygen or when they use it up faster than they can get it. So again, this happens in your muscle cells. When you push your muscles to the limit, they start doing regular respiration aerobically faster and faster until they just run out of all the oxygen gas they have, and then they switch to anaerobic. So when you are doing a very vigorous, high intensity, high weight workout, high resistance workout, you'll force your muscles into anaerobic respiration after a fairly short period of time. If you do a lower intensity workout where you're not pushing everything to the limit, then your muscles will stay longer in the aerobic domain. So we're going to talk about the consequences of that physically, how these different types of respiration become dominant in different forms of exercise and the effects that those have on your body.